minimum wage paycheck buys you exactly nothing in this city. But for Ruby Calloway, 3 crumpled dollar bills bought her the attention of a man the entire underworld crossed the street to avoid. She thought she was just helping a confused old man who couldn't find his wallet. She didn't know his grandson would spend the next 48 hours tearing the city apart trying to find the girl who'd shown his grandfather kindness. Some good deeds don't just go unpunished. Some of them detonate your whole life. The fluorescent lights of Value Mart buzzed overhead, casting everything in that sickly greenish glow that made even fresh produce look tired. Ruby stood in the express lane with a basket holding exactly 4 items: a loaf of the cheapest bread on the shelf, a jar of peanut butter, a bag of rice, and a single yellow onion. $63 stood between her and next month's rent, and she intended to keep every cent of it that she possibly could. It was Thursday, 7:40 p.m., the dead hour between the after-work rush and the late-night stragglers. Ruby had just finished a double shift at the Blue Plate Diner 2 blocks over, and her feet throbbed inside sneakers that had long since given up on providing arch support. She smelled like fryer grease and burnt coffee, and she was fairly certain there was a splash of syrup dried somewhere on her collar. She didn't care. She just wanted to get home, eat something, and collapse. Ahead of her in line, an elderly man was holding up the checkout with a slow, mortifying fumble through a leather coin purse that looked older than Ruby herself. He was small, maybe 5'6", with a thick head of silver hair combed neatly to one side and a wool overcoat that had clearly been expensive once, decades ago, judging by the fraying at the cuffs. His hands trembled as he counted out crumpled bills onto the conveyor belt, one at a time, like a man defusing a bomb. "That's $14.60, the cashier said. Her name tag read Peggy, and her tone suggested she had already decided how the rest of her evening was going to go, and it did not include patience. She snapped her gum and drummed manicured nails against the register. "You're $2 short, sir." I know I had it," the old man murmured, his accent thick, syllables rounding in a way that made Ruby think of old black-and-white films. "My grandson gave me $40 this morning. I don't understand." "Well, it's not here now," Peggy said flatly. "You want me to put back the coffee or the crackers?" The old man's shoulders sagged. He looked down at his small collection of groceries: a box of imported coffee, a sleeve of butter crackers, a carton of eggs, a bunch of bananas, like a man being asked to choose which child to leave behind. There was a raw, exposed embarrassment on his face that Ruby recognized instantly. She had seen that exact expression on her own mother's face more times than she wanted to remember, standing at pharmacy counters, at the DMV, in front of landlords. It was the look of dignity trying very hard not to visibly crumble. Behind Ruby, a man in a business suit sighed loudly and checked his watch, as if the old man's poverty were a personal inconvenience scheduled specifically to ruin his evening. Ruby didn't think about it. She just stepped out of line, walked up to the register, and set a $5 bill on the belt. "That covers it," she said to Peggy. "Keep the change for his trouble." Peggy blinked, clearly annoyed at having her small cruelty interrupted, but she rang it through without complaint. The old man turned to Ruby, his pale blue eyes wide with something between shock and relief. "Sweetheart, you didn't need to do that," he said, his voice thick. "It's $2, Ruby said, waving it off before it could turn into a whole moment. "Please, don't worry about it. I've had worse checkout lines than this." Up close, she noticed things that didn't quite add up. His coat, threadbare at the cuffs, was cashmere. She recognized the weave from folding laundry at a hotel job she'd had 2 winters back. and on his wrist, half hidden by his sleeve, sat a heavy gold watch that looked like it cost more than her car, if she'd had a car. "People aren't usually this kind in this city," the old man said, gathering his bags carefully. "Maybe they're just having a bad week," Ruby said with a tired smile. "Get home safe, okay?" "Salvatore," the old man said, extending a slightly shaking hand. "My name is Salvatore." "Ruby." He smiled, and it transformed his whole face. Years seemed to lift off him for just a second, replaced by something sharp and grateful underneath the confusion. "Thank you, Ruby. My grandson will want to know your name." She didn't think anything of that sentence. She just nodded, grabbed her own bagged groceries, paid for them with the 20 and change she had left, and walked the 12 blocks home through the cold, thinking about nothing more complicated than whether she had enough hot water left for a shower. She had no idea that 6 miles away, in a house that took up an entire hillside, a man was reviewing grainy black and white grocery store footage on a tablet, and that the trajectory of her entire, small, careful life had just been quietly, irrevocably rewritten. The Blue Plate Diner smelled like it always did on a Friday night: bacon grease, burnt coffee, and the particular exhausted sweat of a kitchen running 2 cooks short. Ruby had been on her feet since 6 a.m. Her apron pocket held $41 in tips, which was either a decent night or a devastating one, depending entirely on whether her landlord decided to be difficult about rent again. She was wiping down the counter near the register at 10:45 p.m., the diner down to its last 3 tables, when the bell over the door jingled and the temperature of the room seemed to drop 10 degrees. 3 men walked in. They weren't diner people. That was obvious in the way the room reorganized itself around them without anyone deciding to. 2 of them were built like linebackers, wearing dark coats that did nothing to disguise the width of their shoulders. The 3rd man walked between them, and he was the one the whole room seemed to bend toward, even though he was the leanest of the 3. He was tall, with dark hair cut close and precise, wearing a charcoal overcoat over a suit that looked like it had never once touched a dry cleaner's rack that charged less than $100. His jaw was sharp, clean-shaven, and his eyes, dark, nearly black, moved across the diner with the unhurried thoroughness of a man doing inventory. Old Pete, one of the regulars nursing a decaf in the corner booth, quietly folded his newspaper, left a 10 on the table for a $4 coffee, and slipped out the door without making eye contact with anyone. The lean man walked directly to the counter and sat down on the stool across from Ruby. The hinges of the stool squeaked. He didn't order anything, he just looked at her. "Can I help you?" Ruby asked. Her voice came out steadier than she felt. Her pulse was hammering so hard she could feel it in her throat. "Ruby Calloway," the man said. It wasn't a question. Something cold slid down her spine. "Do I know you?" "No," he said. His voice was low, deliberate, faintly accented in a way that suggested Italian roots buried under years of American schooling. "My name is Dante Marchetti." The name landed on the diner like a dropped plate. Behind Ruby, she heard the cook, Ramon, go suspiciously quiet at the pass window. Anyone who'd lived in this city more than a year knew the Marchetti name the way you knew which streets not to walk down after dark. They didn't run drugs or guns, not anymore, not that anyone could prove. They ran the ports, the unions, half the construction permits downtown, and, according to rumor, a fair number of the politicians who signed off on them. "What can I get you, Mr. Marchetti?" Ruby said, forcing her voice level. "We're out of the meatloaf special, and I don't think you drink our coffee." He didn't smile, but something flickered at the corner of his mouth. "I'm not here for the coffee." He reached into his coat and produced a thick, sealed white envelope, sliding it across the counter until it stopped inches from her hand. Ruby stared at it like it might bite her. "My grandfather," Dante said quietly, "has a habit of wandering. He slipped his driver yesterday evening and walked 11 blocks to the grocery store on 5th. We had 6 men searching 3 neighborhoods for him. When we finally found him, he was walking home with a bag of groceries and a story about a girl who paid $2 so a cashier wouldn't humiliate him in front of a line of strangers. "I just covered the difference," Ruby said. "It was nothing. It was $2. "It was not nothing to him," Dante said, and for the first time something genuinely warm cracked through the flat authority in his voice. "He has not stopped talking about you. He made me pull the security footage from the store just so he could describe you accurately. That does not happen. My grandfather does not get sentimental over strangers." "I'm happy he got home safe," Ruby said carefully. "But I don't want anything for it." Dante tapped the envelope. "There's $10,000 in here. Consider it a thank you." Ruby looked at the envelope. She thought about her rent, 3 days overdue. She thought about the check engine light that had been on in her car for 2 months, the one she couldn't afford to look at. She thought about groceries and gas and the slow, grinding arithmetic of being broke in an expensive city. Then she slid the envelope back across the counter with 2 fingers, firm and final. "I don't want your money, Mr. Marchetti." Something shifted behind his eyes. Not anger, something closer to genuine surprise, like she'd rearranged furniture in a room he thought he had memorized. "Excuse me?" "I did something nice for an old man because it was the right thing to do, not because I wanted a reward," Ruby said, meeting his gaze even though every instinct in her body was screaming at her to look away. "I don't need $10,000 from a man like you, and I definitely don't want to owe you anything. So thank you for stopping by, but I think you should go." The 2 men by the door shifted their weight, hands drifting subtly toward their jackets. Dante raised 2 fingers, a small, economical gesture, and they went still instantly. He looked at the rejected envelope for a long moment, then tucked it back into his coat. He studied her the way you'd study a puzzle that had unexpectedly refused to solve itself the way it was supposed to. "You don't want to owe me," he repeated slowly, as if tasting the words. "No." "All right, Ruby Calloway." He stood, and the stool's squeal seemed louder this time in the silence. "I won't force it on you, but I don't like unfinished business, and I especially don't like leaving a debt unpaid." He turned and walked out, his men falling into step behind him, and the diner exhaled all at once, conversations resuming in a nervous, too bright rush. Ruby stood behind the counter, her hands shaking so badly she had to grip the edge of it to steady herself. She thought she'd just been smart. She thought she'd cut the thread before it could tie itself around her. She had, in fact, just made herself the single most interesting problem in Dante Marchetti's entire orderly, controlled life. Paranoia doesn't announce itself. It creeps in through small things, checking a lock twice instead of once, glancing at parked cars a beat too long, flinching at a car door slamming 3 streets away. For 2 days after the diner, Ruby lived in that low electric hum of dread, waiting for some consequence to arrive, though she couldn't have said what kind. On Sunday morning, she was sitting in the corner booth of the 24-hour laundromat on Erie Street, watching her one good work shirt tumble through the dryer when the bell over the door chimed and the smell of cold rain and expensive cologne cut straight through the laundromat's usual stench of bleach and fabric softener. She didn't need to look up to know who it was. "Are you following me, Mr. Marchetti?" Ruby asked, not lifting her eyes from her paperback. "Because I'm fairly sure that's illegal, even for people who apparently own half the city council." "My grandfather refused breakfast this morning," Dante said, walking slowly down the aisle between the washers, his dress shoes clicking against cracked linoleum. He was alone this time, no security in sight, which somehow made him more unsettling, not less. "He says the girl from the grocery store is going hungry because she gave away her last dollars for a stranger. He won't eat until he knows you're taken care of." Ruby blinked, thrown entirely off balance. She had braced for a threat, maybe another envelope, not a report on an elderly man's appetite. "I'm not going hungry," she said. "I have a job. 2, actually, if you count the weekend shifts at the laundromat's sister diner." "I know," Dante said. "You make $11 an hour at the Blue Plate. You're 2 months behind on a car repair you can't afford. Your mother passed 3 years ago and left you with medical bills you're still paying down $400 a month." The words landed like small, precise blows. Ruby's grip tightened on her paperback. "That's an invasion of privacy." "It's due diligence," Dante said, not unkindly. "I don't like unknowns near my family." He reached into his coat, and this time he didn't produce an envelope. He set down a thick, matte black business card, a single phone number embossed in silver ink, nothing else. "I own a restaurant downtown," he said. "Rosalind's on 6th. I need a floor manager. The pay is triple what you make now, full benefits, no cash under the table, no strings you're imagining. My grandfather asked me to make sure you were taken care of, and I intend to honor that." "Why does it matter so much to you what he wants?" Something flickered across Dante's face, brief, unguarded, gone before she could fully read it. "Because he raised me," he said simply. "Because I have never in my life seen a stranger turn down money from my family, and I find that I would like to understand why." He didn't wait for her answer. He set the card gently on top of her folded laundry and walked back out into the gray afternoon, leaving Ruby alone with the rhythmic thump of the dryer and a decision she'd never asked to make. She didn't call the number. For 4 days she carried the card in her apron pocket like a splinter she refused to dig out, telling herself she was simply too stubborn to be bought, too proud to accept help from a man whose family controlled half the docks in the city. The trouble, she would later realize, was never really about Dante Marchetti's money. It was about what refusing it had made her look like to everyone else watching. She found that out on a Tuesday night, taking the trash out behind the diner. The alley was dim, lit by a single flickering security light, the dumpster reeking faintly of old grease. She'd made this walk 100 times without a second thought. Tonight, 2 men peeled off the brick wall like shadows detaching themselves from the dark. "Well, look who it is," the taller one said, stepping into the weak circle of light. He had the jittery energy of someone running on something other than sleep. Marchetti's little charity case. Ruby's stomach dropped straight through the pavement. She took a slow step backward, scanning for an exit, but the 2 men had already cut off the alley's only clear path to the street. "I don't know what you're talking about," she said, keeping her voice as level as she could manage. "Sure you don't," the shorter one giggled, a wet, unpleasant sound. "Word is the Ice King sent his own guard to check up on a diner waitress. He doesn't do favors for strangers, which means you're either a weakness or you're a liability. Either way, we figure we can use you." The taller man reached for her arm. Ruby yanked back, her shoulder blades hitting cold metal as she stumbled into the dumpster, heart hammering, mind racing for anything: a brick, a broken bottle, the fire door that was, infuriatingly, locked from the outside. She never got the chance to find one. A shape moved at the mouth of the alley with a speed that didn't seem entirely human, and then the taller man was simply on the ground, his arm bent at an angle that made Ruby's stomach turn, even though, thank God, nothing seemed broken beyond recovery. He groaned, clutching his shoulder, more startled than seriously hurt. Standing over him was Dante. He wasn't wearing the tailored calm he'd worn in the diner. His coat was open, his whole body coiled with a barely restrained violence that made the alley feel suddenly 10 degrees colder. The shorter man froze, hands flying up, eyes wide with the particular terror of a person who has just recognized exactly whose territory he'd wandered into. Mr. Marchetti, we didn't know she was… We thought she was just some… Dante didn't let him finish. He crossed the distance in 2 strides, grabbed the man by the collar, and slammed him back against the brick wall, hard enough to knock the wind out of him. "If you ever come near her again," Dante said, his voice a low, flat register that was somehow more frightening than shouting would have been, "you will regret that you were ever born in this city. Do you understand me?" The man nodded frantically. Dante released him, and both men scrambled away into the dark, the taller one still clutching his arm, neither of them looking back. Silence dropped over the alley, broken only by Ruby's own ragged breathing. Dante turned to her, and for one strange, suspended second, the mask of the untouchable boss slipped entirely, replaced by something rawer. "Are you hurt?" he asked, his voice rough. "I'm fine," Ruby managed, though her hands were shaking so hard she had to press them flat against the cold metal of the dumpster to steady them. "Just… startled." He stepped closer, slowly, the way you'd approach something you didn't want to spook. "You didn't call the number." "Would it have stopped this?" Ruby shot back, adrenaline making her reckless. "They didn't want me, Dante. They wanted leverage against you. I'm just collateral damage in whatever war you're running." "I know," Dante said quietly. "That's exactly why you're not staying in this neighborhood tonight." "I'm not going anywhere with you." "Your stubbornness is going to get you hurt, Ruby." His dark eyes locked on hers, and there was something almost pleading buried under the authority. "You refused my money. You refused the job. I've run out of clean ways to keep you safe from a distance. So we're going to do this the difficult way instead." He held out his hand. Ruby looked at it, at the faint scar crossing his knuckles, at the steadiness of it despite what she'd just watched him do, and, against every instinct honed by a lifetime of learning not to trust powerful men, she took it. The car ride was silent except for the rhythmic hiss of tires on wet asphalt. Ruby sat rigid against the leather seat, replaying the alley over and over, her pulse only slowly beginning to settle. Dante sat across from her, his phone in his hand, though she noticed he wasn't actually looking at the screen. "I have a shift tomorrow," Ruby said eventually, mostly to fill the silence. "At the diner." "I bought the blue plate an hour ago," Dante said, without looking up. "You don't need the shift." Ruby stared at him. "You bought the diner? Tonight? Because of my shift schedule?" "The owner had been trying to sell for 2 years. I made an offer he couldn't refuse to spend another minute considering." He finally glanced up, and something almost like humor touched his mouth. "I didn't threaten him, if that's the question in your eyes. I simply pay very well and very fast." "I'm not property, Mr. Marchetti. You can't just rearrange my life because you feel guilty." "You're not property," he agreed. "But as long as you're walking around unprotected, you are a target for anyone who wants leverage against my family. I can't allow that. You'll stay at the house until the men responsible for tonight are identified and dealt with. After that, you're free to go wherever you like." "And if I don't want to stay?" "Then I'll post men outside your apartment, your work, and every grocery store within a mile of your building, and your life will become significantly less private than it is right now," Dante said evenly. "I'd rather you simply agree to the house." Ruby exhaled slowly, out of arguments, and, if she was honest with herself, out of the energy required to keep fighting a decision that had effectively already been made for her. They passed through heavy iron gates 20 minutes later, the car climbing a winding driveway toward a house that sat on a bluff overlooking the water. Less a mansion, More, a fortress dressed up in gray stone and glass. Cameras tracked their approach the whole way up. Inside, the floors were pale marble that echoed under Ruby's worn sneakers, and everything smelled faintly of lemon polish and something colder underneath, like the house had never quite decided to let itself be lived in. "Your room is upstairs," Dante said, leading her through a wide hallway. "There's a wardrobe. The clothes are new. You're welcome to wear them, or not. That's entirely your choice. Tomorrow, someone will collect a few of your things from your apartment." "I don't need someone going through my apartment." "Your apartment is compromised," Dante said, his tone hardening slightly. "They know where you live now. Going back there tonight is not a reasonable option." He opened a heavy door onto a guest room bigger than Ruby's entire apartment. A king bed, floor-to-ceiling windows looking out over dark water, a small fire already crackling in a stone hearth she hadn't even known existed in a house like this. "Your clothes are wet," Dante said, his eyes flicking briefly to her damp sleeves. "There's a robe in the closet if you'd rather change out of them tonight." "And what about Salvatore?" Ruby asked, crossing her arms. "Does he know his grandson drags women off the street to settle his debts?" Something shifted, briefly, across Dante's composed face, the first real crack she'd seen since the alley. "My grandfather is asleep. He had a difficult day. You will not disturb him tonight." "Right," Ruby said, more sharply than she meant to. "Because the great Dante Marchetti can control everything except an old man's bedtime." It was an unkind thing to say, and she knew it the moment it left her mouth. She was scared and angry and exhausted, and he was the easiest target in the room. Dante didn't raise his voice. He stepped fully into the room, and the temperature seemed to drop several degrees with him. "I do what I have to do to keep the people I love safe," he said, low and even. "I move money, I move favors, I move people out of harm's way, so that my grandfather can spend his last years in a warm house instead of worrying about which of his enemies is watching him buy groceries. You think you understand my world because you've had a hard few years. You don't." He turned and walked out, and the lock clicked softly into place from the outside a moment later. Ruby stood alone in the middle of the enormous, beautiful room, staring at the dark water through the window, feeling less like a guest and more like a very well-dressed prisoner. She wasn't sure yet what she was to this family. She only knew that whatever it was, she hadn't asked for it, and there didn't seem to be any clean way back out. 4 days in a fortress changes the shape of a person's days. The house ran with a precision that reminded Ruby of a hospital more than a home. Meals delivered at exact hours, staff who materialized to clean and vanished before she could thank them, quiet men in dark clothes patrolling a perimeter she could see but never fully map. Ruby refused, out of some stubborn last thread of independence, to fully assimilate. She left the designer clothes hanging untouched in the closet, and instead washed her own 2 work shirts in the enormous bathroom sink, hanging them over the heated towel rack to dry. She skipped the elaborate dinners the kitchen staff prepared, and instead snuck down at odd hours to make herself toast and black coffee, the same breakfast she'd have made in her own tiny kitchen if any of this were normal. It was on one of those early mornings, just past 6, that she found Salvatore. The kitchen was empty, quiet except for the low hum of the refrigerator, when she heard shuffling footsteps behind her. She turned to find the old man from the grocery store standing in the doorway in a heavy robe, his white hair mussed from sleep, blinking at her with an expression that took a moment too long to sharpen into recognition. "Ruby," he said finally, and his whole face lit up. "You're really here. Dante said you would be, but I didn't quite believe him. "Good morning, Salvatore," Ruby said, relieved to see a familiar, gentle face in a house otherwise built of hard edges. "Coffee? Please, black, no sugar, though everyone in this house insists on giving me sugar as if I'm a child." He settled himself onto a stool at the marble island with a small groan, rubbing at his lower back. "You made an impression on my grandson, you know. He does not usually bring anyone here. I think your grandson mostly wanted to make sure I didn't get hurt because of him," Ruby said carefully, sliding a mug across the counter. "I don't think it's anything more complicated than that." Salvatore's pale eyes crinkled with something that looked suspiciously like amusement. "You would be surprised how uncomplicated Dante's decisions usually are. He has never once brought a guest to sit at this counter. Not one, in 5 years. Maybe I'm just his very expensive insurance policy," Ruby said dryly. "Maybe," Salvatore agreed, sipping his coffee. "But insurance policies don't usually make a man pace his office at midnight." He said it lightly, almost teasingly, but there was a shrewdness underneath it that reminded Ruby this was not, in fact, a confused old man who'd merely wandered too far from home one evening. There was a sharp, careful intelligence sitting quietly behind his gentle manners. Before Ruby could respond, a shadow fell across the doorway. Dante stood there, fully dressed despite the early hour, his tie already perfectly knotted, watching the two of them with an expression she couldn't quite read. "Grandpa," he said, his voice softening in a way she hadn't heard him use before. "You're up early. The doctor wanted you resting until at least 8. "I was hungry, and Ruby made excellent coffee," Salvatore said, unbothered. "You should try being less dramatic about my breakfast schedule, Dante." Dante's mouth twitched, almost a smile, gone as quickly as it appeared. His eyes moved to Ruby, and there was something complicated in that look. Gratitude tangled up with an irritation that didn't seem to actually be directed at her at all. "My office, tonight, 10 o'clock, he said to Ruby. "We need to talk." The mahogany doors of Dante's office swung open at precisely 10. The room smelled of old leather and expensive whiskey, bookshelves lining every wall, heavy curtains drawn against the night. Dante sat behind a massive desk, pouring 2 fingers of amber liquid into a crystal glass. He slid a second glass across the desk without looking up. "I don't drink while people are deciding what to do with my life," Ruby said, staying near the door. "You're not working. Neither am I. Not really. Not tonight." He finally looked up, and she was struck again by how tired he looked underneath the composure. The kind of exhaustion that lived in the bones, not just the eyes. "You handled him well this morning. Better than the staff usually manage. He's a sweet man. He just wanted coffee and company." Ruby stepped further into the room, though she still didn't sit. "You could try talking to him like that yourself, you know. He's sharper than you give him credit for." Something flickered across Dante's face. "He raised me after my parents died. I was 7. He never once let me see him afraid, even when things were very bad for our family. I owe him more than I can ever repay, and I am terrified, every single day, of losing him the way I lost them." The admission hung in the quiet office, unexpectedly bare. Ruby hadn't expected honesty like that from a man who, 4 days ago, had broken another man's arm in an alley without raising his voice. "I owe you an apology," Dante said, setting down his glass. "I brought you here and treated you like something fragile that needed managing. I assumed you were helpless. You're not. You're poor, which is an entirely different thing, and I should have known the difference." "There is a difference," Ruby agreed quietly, allowing herself finally to sit in the chair across from him. "A pretty big one. The men from the alley were hired by a rival family testing whether bringing a civilian close to me had made me careless," Dante said. They've been dealt with. The immediate threat is over. Ruby's stomach turned slightly at how casually he said, dealt with, but she pushed the thought aside for now. So I can go home. You can, Dante agreed. I'll have a car take you back tonight if you want it. I'll clear the balance on your car repair, cover whatever's left on your mother's medical bills. Call it settled between us. It was, in every practical sense, exactly what she'd wanted from the very first night. A clean exit, her old life restored, no strings, no debts. But sitting in the warm lamplight of his office, she found herself thinking not of her apartment, but of Salvatore's face lighting up over a cup of black coffee, of the particular loneliness she'd glimpsed in this enormous house before she'd ever walked into it. "And who makes Salvatore his coffee tomorrow?" Ruby asked. Dante's hand tightened slightly around his glass. "What? You have a staff of what, a dozen people? None of them sit and actually talk to him. He told me himself he hasn't had anyone at that counter in 5 years. Ruby leaned forward. "I'm not agreeing to be your permanent house guest out of charity, Dante. I'm asking for a job. A real one, with a paycheck and a contract. Taking care of your grandfather, keeping him company, managing his schedule, making sure the people around him don't treat him like a fragile old relic." Dante studied her for a long moment, clearly recalibrating. "You're negotiating." "I'm negotiating," Ruby confirmed. "I want fair pay for a caregiver/companion position. I want my mother's remaining medical debt cleared as a signing bonus, not a handout. And I want the freedom to come and go from this house without an armed escort trailing me to the pharmacy." "The guards stay," Dante said immediately. "Non-negotiable. If you're connected to this family, you're a potential target, whether you like that fact or not. They'll keep their distance, but they stay." Ruby considered this. It was, she supposed, a reasonable compromise for a man who apparently didn't know how to offer anything less than absolute security. "Fine." Dante stood, extending his hand across the desk. Ruby looked at it, at the faint scar across his knuckles, visible even in the low light, and shook it. "Welcome to the house, Ruby Calloway," he said. Over the following weeks, something in the house's rigid architecture began, very slowly, to loosen. Ruby didn't just manage Salvatore's schedule. She quietly reorganized the household around him without ever quite announcing that she was doing it. She fired, or rather, respectfully suggested be reassigned, a nurse who spoke to Salvatore in the syrupy, patronizing tone people use on toddlers. She started a standing Wednesday puzzle night at the kitchen island, 100-piece puzzles that Salvatore complained were beneath him and then spent 2 hours completing anyway. She learned exactly how he liked his coffee, black, 1 sugar despite his protests, because she'd caught him sneaking sugar into his own cup when he thought no one was watching. Dante became, if anything, more of a ghost around his own house. He left before sunrise and returned long after Ruby had gone to bed, the scent of his cologne lingering in the hallway hours after he'd passed through it, murmured phone calls bleeding faintly through the heavy door of his study. One evening, nearly 3 weeks in, Ruby sat cross-legged on the library floor, mending a loose button on one of Salvatore's cardigans, while a fire burned low in the hearth. The double doors opened, and Dante walked in, looking more exhausted than she'd ever seen him, his tie loosened, his collar undone. He didn't say anything. He just sank into the leather armchair across from her and closed his eyes. "Long day?" Ruby asked, biting off a loose thread. "Long month," he murmured, not opening his eyes. "There's a shipping contract falling apart that 3 different unions are trying to use as leverage against each other. It's tedious in the way that migraines are tedious." "Salvatore ate a full dinner tonight," Ruby offered. "Roast chicken." He remembered the name of the restaurant your father used to take him to on his birthday, and he told me the whole story, twice. Something in Dante's shoulders loosened at that. Good, he said quietly. Thank you. Ruby set the mended cardigan aside and studied him for a moment. The dark circles under his eyes, the careful stillness he held, even when he was clearly running on fumes. He looked, in this unguarded moment, less like the man who could freeze a room with 2 words, and more like someone who'd simply been carrying too much for too long, entirely alone. She stood, walked to the small bar cart in the corner, and poured 2 fingers of his usual whiskey into a glass. She set it on the table beside him without a word. Dante opened his eyes, glancing at the glass, then up at her with faint surprise. "You're paying me too well for this job," Ruby said, deadpan, already turning to leave the room. "I figure I should start bartending on the side to earn my keep." She caught, just before she stepped through the doorway, the sound of something that might have been a genuine, tired laugh. It was the following Saturday when the quiet, careful rhythm of the house was interrupted. Ruby was in the garden with Salvatore, helping him prune a stubborn rosebush he insisted on tending himself, despite his doctor's gentle suggestions otherwise, when a black SUV came tearing up the long driveway, far faster than any of the house's usual vehicles ever traveled. It skidded to a stop near the front steps, and Arthur, Dante's head of security, a broad, quiet man who rarely raised his voice for anything, got out looking genuinely rattled for the first time since Ruby had met him. "Where's Mr. Marchetti?" he called toward the house. "In his office," Ruby answered, straightening up, her stomach already twisting with unease. "What happened?" "There was an incident downtown, a meeting that went badly." Arthur was already moving toward the door. He's fine, just banged up. Nothing serious. But he insisted on coming straight home instead of the clinic." Ruby's heart lurched anyway, despite the reassurance, and she guided Salvatore gently back toward the house, keeping her voice light and steady, even as her pulse hammered. "Let's get you inside. It's getting chilly out here." Dante appeared in the front hallway a few minutes later, and Ruby's carefully composed calm nearly cracked at the sight of him, his suit jacket torn at the shoulder seam, a dark bruise blooming along his jaw, a shallow cut above one eyebrow that had bled enough to stain his collar. He was walking under his own power, which she clung to as a good sign, but he moved stiffly, one hand pressed to his ribs. "I'm fine," he said, before she could even ask, catching the alarm on her face. "It looks worse than it is. A disagreement got physical. I promise you, the other man came out of it significantly worse than I did." "Sit down," Ruby said, already reaching for the first aid kit that lived in the hallway closet, her voice slipping automatically into the same brisk, steady register she used whenever Salvatore had a bad morning. "Kitchen, now. Let me look at that cut before it scars badly." "I have a doctor for this." "Your doctor is 20 minutes out, according to Arthur, and you're bleeding on a very expensive rug," Ruby said, already steering him by the elbow toward a kitchen stool. "Sit." To her genuine surprise, he sat. She cleaned the cut above his eyebrow with careful, steady hands, aware of him watching her the entire time with an intensity that made her fingers less steady than she wanted them to be. Up close, she could see the fading remnants of an older bruise along his jaw, days old, that he'd apparently never mentioned. "You've been in fights before," she said quietly, dabbing antiseptic along the new cut. "Recently, I mean. This isn't the first one." "It's not," he admitted. "It comes with the territory. I try to keep most of it away from this house." "You don't have to protect me from knowing what your life actually looks like, Dante." She taped a small bandage over the cut, her fingers lingering a beat longer than strictly necessary against his temple. "I've been living here a month. I think I have a fairly good idea by now." He caught her wrist gently before she could pull her hand away, his thumb resting lightly against her pulse point. Most people who get a good idea of what my life actually looks like leave, Ruby. I'm not most people, she said, holding his gaze steadily despite the way her heart was suddenly hammering for reasons that had very little to do with fear. I told you that the first night, in the diner. For a long moment, neither of them moved, the kitchen quiet except for the low hum of the refrigerator and the distant sound of Salvatore's radio playing an old jazz record down the hall. Then the front door opened, Dr. Harmon's brisk footsteps announcing his arrival, and the moment dissolved as quickly as it had formed. But something had shifted between them, quiet and unspoken, and neither of them tried very hard to pretend otherwise for the rest of that evening. 2 days later, the reason for the fight became clear over a subdued dinner that Dante, for once, actually stayed home to eat. His name is Franco Del Vecchio, Dante said, cutting his food with more force than strictly necessary. He runs the docks on the east side. He's been trying to push into territory that isn't his for months, and he decided the best way to test my patience was to insult my grandfather at a business dinner in front of 6 other families. That's what the fight was about? Ruby asked. Someone insulted Salvatore? Franco suggested my grandfather was too old and too soft to have ever really built anything, and that I only respected him out of guilt rather than genuine regard, Dante said flatly. I disagreed with his assessment. Physically. Salvatore, who had been quietly eating his soup through this entire exchange, set down his spoon with surprising precision. Franco Del Vecchio's father used to work for me 40 years ago, he said, his voice carrying an edge of dry amusement rather than anger. I fired him for skimming off the top of a shipment. Apparently, the son inherited both the ambition and the poor judgment. Dante's jaw tightened. He's been quiet since the dinner, but I don't trust quiet from a man like that. I've doubled the security rotation around the house for the next few weeks. I'd rather be careful than sorry. Doubled from what it already was? Ruby asked. I already can't walk to the mailbox without someone materializing out of a hedge. Would you rather I stopped? Dante asked, an eyebrow raised. No, Ruby admitted. I suppose I've gotten used to it. Salvatore watched this exchange with the barely concealed satisfaction of a man who very much enjoyed seeing his grandson slightly flustered by anyone at all, let alone a woman who'd once told him off in a diner without flinching. You two argue like an old married couple, Salvatore said mildly, returning to his soup. It's very entertaining. Please, continue. Ruby felt her face heat, and across the table for just a moment, so did Dante's. The trouble arrived 3 weeks later on an unremarkable Tuesday evening in the most anticlimactic way imaginable, with a knock at the front gate instead of gunfire, which Ruby would later think was somehow more unsettling than if it had been dramatic. She was in the library reading when Arthur's voice crackled over the house intercom, tighter than usual. Mr. Marchetti, you'll want to come to the front gate. Franco Del Vecchio is here. He's alone, unarmed, and he's asking to speak with you directly. Dante appeared in the library doorway less than a minute later, already shrugging his suit jacket back on. Stay inside, he told Ruby. This shouldn't take long. Let me come, Ruby said, setting her book down. If he's trying to make peace, having a witness who isn't already loyal to you might actually help your case, not hurt it. Dante hesitated, clearly weighing the offer, then gave a short nod. Stay behind me. If I tell you to go inside, you go inside. No arguing. Deal. Franco Del Vecchio turned out to be a broad-shouldered man in his 40s with an expensive suit and an uneasy, deferential posture that suggested whatever had brought him here tonight had cost him something to work up to. He stood just outside the gate, flanked by no one, his hands visible and empty. "Dante," Franco said, inclining his head. "Thank you for seeing me." "You have 5 minutes," Dante said, his tone giving away nothing. Franco's eyes flicked briefly to Ruby, curious but not hostile, before returning to Dante. "I came to apologize. What I said about your grandfather at the dinner was out of line, and frankly, it was stupid. I've spent 3 weeks hearing from half the families in this city about how badly I misjudged the room, and I'd like to fix it before it becomes something neither of us can walk back from." "Apologies don't rebuild trust on their own," Dante said evenly. "No," Franco agreed. "Which is why I'm also formally withdrawing my claim on the eastern shipping routes. They were never really mine to push for in the first place, and I let my ambition get ahead of my judgment. I'd rather lose the routes than lose the peace we've had in this city for the last decade." Dante studied him for a long moment, clearly weighing the sincerity of the offer against years of accumulated caution. Finally, he extended his hand. "Apology accepted," Dante said. "Try insulting my grandfather again, and this conversation will go very differently." Franco shook his hand, visibly relieved, and with a final respectful nod toward Ruby, turned and walked back to his car. Ruby let out a breath she hadn't realized she'd been holding as the gate rolled shut behind him. "That's it? Weeks of tension and it just ends? Over a handshake at the gate?" "Most of it does, eventually," Dante said, watching the taillights disappear down the road. "The version of my world you've seen, the alley, the fight, the security rotations, that's the exception, not the rule. Most disputes get settled with conversations like that one, not violence. I'd just rather you never have to find out the hard way which kind you're dealing with." "I appreciate that," Ruby said quietly. "Truly." They stood together at the gate for a long moment, the tension of the last several weeks finally, visibly easing out of Dante's shoulders. Then he glanced sideways at her, something almost playful sneaking into his expression for the first time since she'd known him. "You told a man who runs half the Port Authority that you wanted to be a witness to his negotiations," Dante said. "You do realize most people in this city are terrified to even be in the same room as either of us." "I told you weeks ago," Ruby said, echoing herself. "I'm not most people." A week after Franco Del Vecchio's apology at the gate, Ruby's old life briefly resurfaced in the form of a phone call from Marla, the day shift cook at what used to be the Blue Plate Diner, now technically owned by a man who could buy the whole block without noticing the dent in his accounts. "You have to come see this place," Marla said, laughing into the phone. "New paint, new booths, and somehow the coffee's actually good now. Whoever bought us out clearly threw money at it and walked away. You should come by. Everybody keeps asking about you." Ruby mentioned it that evening over dinner, half joking, and was surprised when Dante immediately offered to drive her the following afternoon. "You don't have to babysit me at my old diner," Ruby said, amused. "It's 4 blocks from the grocery store where this whole thing started. I think I can handle a nostalgia visit alone." "I'd like to see it," Dante said simply. "You talk about that place more than you realize. I want to understand the life you had before all of this." So the next afternoon, Ruby found herself walking back through the doors of the diner in a coat that didn't have a single frayed seam, trailed at a respectful distance by a man the old regulars clearly recognized on sight, judging by the way conversation dipped for a beat before resuming, more careful than before. Marla nearly tackled her at the counter. "Look at you," she said, gripping Ruby's shoulders and studying her like she might have grown a second head. "You look rested. Good rested. I almost didn't recognize you without the bags under your eyes." "It's been a strange few months," Ruby admitted, laughing. "Strange is one word for it." Marla's eyes flicked meaningfully toward Dante, who had settled into a booth near the window with the easy, watchful stillness Ruby had come to recognize as simply how he existed in any room. "Ramon still tells everybody about the night those 3 men walked in, and half the diner nearly had a heart attack. You really landed yourself in the middle of something, huh?" "Something like that," Ruby said. She spent the better part of an hour catching up, hearing about Ramon's new grill setup, about old Pete finally getting his hip replaced, about the new waitress who'd taken over Ruby's old section and kept getting the coffee orders wrong in exactly the way Ruby used to when she'd first started. It was strange, standing in the diner that used to be the entire boundary of her world and feeling like a visitor in it rather than someone who belonged. When she finally slid into the booth across from Dante, he was watching her with quiet curiosity. "You miss it," he said. It wasn't quite a question. "Parts of it," Ruby admitted. "Not the exhaustion, or the rent panic, or flinching every time a customer complained too loudly. But there was something simple about it. I knew exactly what my life was, even when it was hard." "And now?" Ruby considered the question honestly before answering. "Now it's complicated, and occasionally terrifying, and I've had to learn an entirely new set of rules I never signed up to learn." She glanced toward Marla, currently refilling old Pete's decaf with the same brisk efficiency Ruby remembered fondly. "But I don't think I'd trade it. Not for the version of simple I had before." Dante reached across the table, his fingers finding hers over the scratched formica, an old habit of the diner's tables that new paint clearly hadn't managed to fix. "I never wanted to erase where you came from," he said quietly. "I just wanted to make sure you never had to go back to being afraid of it." "I know," Ruby said, and meant it. They stayed another 20 minutes, long enough for Marla to insist on comping their coffee despite Dante's protests, and long enough for Ruby to leave a tip on the table that made the new waitress's eyes go wide. Walking back out into the cold afternoon, her old apron folded neatly in a box somewhere back at the house as a keepsake she hadn't been able to throw away, Ruby felt, for the first time, like she'd finally closed the door on one version of her life without any resentment left over for the woman who'd lived it. Autumn slid into the city gently that year, gilding the trees along the estate's long driveway in orange and gold. Ruby found herself, somewhat to her own surprise, thinking less and less about her old apartment, her old shifts at the diner, the version of her life that had existed before a grocery store checkout line had rearranged everything. She still worked, technically. Her contract with the Marchetti household was real, with a real salary that had let her clear the last of her mother's medical debt and start, for the first time in years, an actual savings account. But the work no longer felt like labor in the way her old jobs had. Some mornings it looked like sitting with Salvatore over crossword puzzles. Other evenings it looked like waiting up with a pot of coffee for Dante to come home from some negotiation that had run late, listening to him talk through the tangled logistics of union contracts and shipping manifests until the tension eased out of his voice. It was on one of those evenings, in early November, that everything finally, quietly, shifted. Ruby was curled in the library's window seat with a book she wasn't really reading, more listening to the rain against the glass, when Dante appeared in the doorway. He'd loosened his tie, and there was something different in the way he was looking at her. Less like a man cataloging a variable, and more like a man who had simply run out of reasons to keep pretending he wasn't looking. "You're still up," he said. "Waiting for you, actually," Ruby admitted, setting her book aside. "Salvatore made me promise to tell you he beat me at gin rummy twice tonight, and that he considers it a personal triumph over both of us." Dante's mouth curved, genuine and easy in a way it rarely was. He cheats. He's cheated at cards since I was a child. He just does it so smoothly that no one ever catches him. I caught him, Ruby said. Twice. I let him win anyway. Of course you did. Dante crossed the room and sat down across from her, close enough that she could smell the rain still clinging to his coat. For a moment, neither of them said anything, the fire crackling low in the hearth, rain ticking steadily against the windows. I've been thinking, Dante said eventually, about the first night at the diner when I put that envelope on the counter and you slid it right back at me. I remember, Ruby said. You looked at me like I'd personally offended your entire family lineage. You had, a little, he admitted. No one had ever refused anything from my family before, not out of principle anyway. It threw me more than I let on. He paused, turning his glass slowly in his hands, choosing his next words with visible care. I've spent months since then trying to figure out why that mattered to me as much as it did. And? Ruby asked, her heart beating a little too fast for someone pretending to be casually curious. And I think, Dante said quietly, that it's because you were the first person in a very long time who wanted absolutely nothing from me. Not money, not protection, not favors. You helped my grandfather because it was the right thing to do, and then you stayed in this house, in this life, because you actually cared about the people in it, not because of anything I could give you. Ruby felt something loosen in her chest, warm and slow. I stayed because Salvatore needed someone who'd actually sit with him instead of just managing him, she said. And because... She hesitated, then decided, after everything they'd already survived together, that honesty was the only thing left worth offering him. Because somewhere in the last few months, this stopped feeling like someone else's life I was borrowing, and started feeling like mine. Dante set his glass down and reached across the small space between them, his hand covering hers on the arm of the window seat, warm and steady. I would like it very much, he said, if you'd consider it that way permanently. Not as an employee, not as a guest under my protection. Just mine, if you'll have that. Ruby laughed softly, equal parts disbelief and something that felt suspiciously like relief. You're asking me to stay with the same face you use to negotiate shipping contracts. I'm out of practice with anything else, Dante admitted, a rare, unguarded smile breaking across his face. Give me time. I'll learn. I think, Ruby said, turning her hand beneath his so their fingers laced together, that I'd like that very much. He leaned in slowly, giving her every chance to pull back if she wanted to, and when she didn't, he kissed her, gently, nothing like the controlled precision he carried through the rest of his life, just quiet and certain and real. Outside, the rain kept falling steadily against the windows, and inside, for the first time since a crumpled $2 bill had first tangled their lives together, neither of them was in any hurry at all. 6 months later, Ruby stood in the kitchen on a bright Saturday morning, watching Salvatore carefully instruct Dante on the proper way to fold a very stubborn batch of homemade pasta dough, both men flour-dusted and squabbling good-naturedly in a mix of English and Italian that Ruby had slowly, patiently begun learning over the winter. You're doing it wrong, Salvatore announced for the third time, swatting his grandson's hands away from the dough. Your mother would be appalled. Ruby, tell him he's doing it wrong. You're doing it wrong, Ruby said obediently, leaning against the counter with her coffee, unable to keep the smile off her face. I run an entire shipping empire, Dante said, mock-wounded, flour smudged along his jaw. and my own grandfather still thinks I can't fold dough correctly." "An empire is easy," Salvatore said, waving a floury hand dismissively. "Pasta requires patience." "You've never once in your life had patience. Not since you were a boy stealing cookies before dinner." Ruby watched them bicker, warm and easy in the golden morning light spilling across the kitchen island, and thought about how impossibly far this moment sat from the fluorescent-lit checkout line where all of it had started. A tired waitress, a confused old man, 2 crumpled dollar bills, and a rude cashier who'd had absolutely no idea what she'd set into motion. She thought about the version of herself who had walked those 12 cold blocks home that first night, worried only about hot water and rent, with no idea that kindness, offered without any expectation of return, was about to hand her an entire family she hadn't known she was missing. Dante caught her watching, and even covered in flour, even bickering with his grandfather over pasta technique. Something in his face went soft and certain when their eyes met. The same look he'd worn the night in the library, the one that told her, more clearly than any words could have, that whatever this was, it wasn't going anywhere. "Ruby," Salvatore called, breaking the moment. "Come settle this properly. Show him how it's actually done." Laughing, she set down her coffee and crossed the kitchen to join them, flour and all. What started with a $5 bill on a checkout counter ended up rewriting the whole shape of Ruby Calloway's life. Proof that sometimes the smallest kindness, offered to the right stranger on the wrong night, is the one thing capable of changing absolutely everything. If this slow-burn mafia romance pulled you in, make sure to like this video and subscribe for more stories just like it. Drop a comment below and let me know. Would you have taken the envelope, or would you have pushed it right back across the counter like Ruby did? See you in the next story.